loser! Look, it's the loser and his loser girlfriend, the perfect couple.
Okay, come on, Ruby. Back off,
What are you
Hector.
gonna do if I don't?
Oh! Don't even think about telling Coach about this, okay? Because you threw the first punch.
It's widely known that changing environments and going to a new place to start afresh is not always enjoyable, and this is the case with Matthew and his mother, Christine, who has moved to another city to stay with her new man, Jacob. Driving to the new school already has Matthew frustrated, and Christine tries comforting him. Well, he can't even be blamed, seeing how he's leaving a private school where he had a scholarship to be enrolled in a public school. She assures him that he'll make new friends, but Matthew knows what it's like to be the new kid in school. She feels he'll adapt because he's a fighter, but Matthew has already resigned himself to hatred of his new school. After Christine drops him off, he begins finding his way with the school guide, but ends up getting in late to his class. He introduces himself to the teacher, Mrs. Nasher, but a student, Nick, makes a loud joke about his tardiness. Mrs. Nasher isn't okay with this and gives Nick detention, but Nick tries to deflect, lying that he and Matthew are friends. Matthew even goes along with the lie to help Nick out, but Mrs. Nasher still disagrees. After class, Nick meets up with Matthew in the hallway, and they properly introduce themselves. Nick makes another joke, which almost gives Matthew a heart attack, but Nick assures him he's joking. Seems Matthew really needs to loosen up. Nick gives him some advice before leaving.
Lose the suit, man. You're just asking for it.
Later that evening at home, Matthew begins arranging his room, and Jacob comes in to help, but Matthew doesn't really feel comfortable with him yet, making things awkward. When Jacob learns that Matthew's grandfather was a pro boxer, he is genuinely surprised, since Christine never shared this. The next morning, Nick meets up with Matthew at school, and his friend Ruby joins them. Nick proposes that Matthew join their ghetto crew, which, according to them, is the coolest non-club in school. Their goal, epic world domination. They're taking it back from all jocks and stuck-up losers. Matthew likes the idea, wondering what he has to do to gain access into the crew. Well, he doesn't really have to do anything, but Nick being Nick has something up his sleeves.
You gotta go up to that girl, Teresa, the tall one with the big smile, and ask her for a date.
Summoning up the courage, Matthew goes to do just this, but things automatically turn sour when Hector, Teresa's boyfriend, comes over. His angry stare and loud bullying voice make Matthew lose his self-confidence, and he falls to the ground as Hector scares him with a pounce. Matthew begins crying quietly, and Hector almost continues bullying him but stops when he notices Doyle, a teacher, watching through the window. Backing off, he takes Teresa and walks away, just as the bell rings for the beginning of classes. Meanwhile, Dan, a janitor, quietly observes Matthew. Ruby and Nick come to help him up, and they all walk together to class. Later at home, Jacob gifts Matthew a book, which immediately makes Matthew warm up to him, since it's one of his favorite boxing books. The next morning, while walking into the school building, Matthew reads his new book and has dropped the suit, thanks to Nick's advice. However, trouble comes knocking when Hector sees him from a distance and walks over with his group of friends, clearly going to cause an issue. As expected, he pours his drink on Matthew's book and clothes, while his friends surround him like a cage. Matthew tries struggling his way out, clearly not wanting any problems, but Hector doesn't let up. Thankfully, Dan notices this and steps in, asking Hector if the empty cup is his trash. Hector quickly denies, pointing at Matthew as the culprit, but Dan makes him pick it up and trash it properly. After that, he sends the boys to class, and they have no other option than to back off. Matthew thanks Dan for his help, and Dan notices his book. He learns that Matthew loves boxing, but doesn't box. He tells him about the boxing club in school, where he can practice and even compete, leaving Matthew surprised. Before leaving to continue his duties, he urges Matthew to look into the club. Taking the advice, he goes to check for more information on the dashboard, but Hector and his gang suddenly appear. This time, Teresa is with them, and she tries telling Hector to let Matthew be, but he doesn't listen. Instead, he snatches the book right out of Matthew's hand and begins taunting him. Before things can escalate, Nick steps in to defend Matthew, which almost leads into a heated fight, but they are eventually separated by a teacher and some students. Unfortunately, Matthew and Nick are put on detention for a week by Principal Lee. Matthew asks about the other guys, and she promises to talk to them separately. Excusing Nick out of the office, she scolds Matthew about his behavior.
Actions have consequences, Matthew. Even though it's hard being the new kid, you need to try and steer clear of trouble.
He tries explaining it was all Hector's fault and feels the detention isn't fair, but Lee reminds him not everything is fair. She advises him to call a teacher if he runs into trouble in the future before dismissing him for class. At home, Christine subtly asks Matthew if he has anything to tell them, and he bluntly reveals his decision to join the boxing club. This isn't what she was expecting at all, and she expresses her dislike about the idea since she thinks it's a brutal and pointless sport that leads nowhere. Tired of the conversation, Matthew tries leaving the table, but Christine stops him. She brings up the detention, but Matthew quickly explains what happened. He only wants her to sign the permission form so he can try out for the team, but Christine feels something must have gotten into him. He blames her for uprooting his life, but Jacob steps in, scolding him for raising his voice at Christine. Matthew quickly follows up with a sarcastic reply, which gets him sent to his room. Later that evening, Christine goes to talk to Matthew in his room, urging him to try and adjust. It's not like Matthew isn't trying, but it's just not going to happen overnight. She admits she's been talking to Jacob and wants to know more about boxing. Matthew feels there's nothing to tell, and he just wants her permission. Christine is frustrated since he's never boxed before, but Matthew has always wanted to. He launches into a tirade of pro boxers who started young, but Christine stops him, insisting it isn't the point. Boxing is dangerous, and even though she always tells Matthew he is a fighter, she just can't stand the thought of him getting sucked into that world. She gets emotional at the thought of him getting hurt. She just wants things to be normal, but Matthew feels she can't blame everything on boxing. She proposes a deal, telling him to make some friends and do anything else, and he eventually gives in. However, the next morning at school, Matthew does a total 180 and enters into the gym for the boxing program. Coach Harward addresses everyone, telling them about the program.
Each year we take a few spots at the national championships for the AIBA. If you're lucky, one, maybe two of you are going to make this team.
Though most of the spots are already filled, each weight division needs an alternate, just in case the champion in that division can't compete. Harward is choosing 2 contenders for each division, and come 8 weeks' time, they'll have the box-off, where the contenders will have a chance to challenge the current champion for the position. Lo and behold, the 2 top champions the contenders would be sparring against turn out to be Hector and another guy named Joe. This instantly sours Matthew's mood, and he begins leaving without signing up, but Dan comes in at that moment and stops his escape. Matthew admits he's leaving because Hector annoys and makes him nervous, but Dan feels it's a good thing since he can use that feeling against Hector in the ring. He begins calling out the names of top boxers who must have felt nervous against their opponents, and encourages Matthew to sign up. Harward makes the new guys spar with Hector and Joe, but when it gets to Matthew's turn, Hector opts to be his partner. Using the opportunity, Hector pummels Matthew like a sack bag, but Matthew manages to land one punch. This almost leads to a fight, but Harward separates them and sends Matthew out because he threw a punch after time out. Later, Dan walks up to Matthew, who's now alone at the gym, sulking in embarrassment. Dan tries talking to him to lift his spirits, insisting he just needs to work on his form and learn to relax. This makes Matthew wonder what he knows about boxing since he's a janitor, but Dan surprises him by sharing that he had dreams of being a heavyweight champion.
Just climbing up the ranks and everything. Make a long story short, driving fast and showing off finally caught up with me. Put an end to all that.
Dan feels a lot of practice could make Matthew good, but Matthew tells him he got kicked out anyway. He properly introduces himself, thanking him for the comfort. Afterward, at Dan's workshed, Matthew is surprised to see a young picture of Dan and the trophy he won. He apologizes for what happened to Dan, but Dan isn't sorry about it. He's married with kids and earns well. Matthew wonders if he couldn't make money from boxing, but Dan shares that one gets into it to be the champ. There are thousands of fighters who never make a dime because of so many reasons, but in his case, it was because he was living too fast. Matthew asks if he could teach him some moves, and Dan decides to show him how to do a proper jab. Some seconds later, the bell goes off, putting an end to their class. Excited, Matthew asks if Dan could be his personal trainer and runs off thrilled about this new development. After 6th period, Matthew comes back for more lessons, and Dan takes him for a little run afterward. Confiding in Dan, Matthew shares that his mom doesn't like the idea of boxing and wants him to be something else, like a lawyer or doctor. Though he had leukemia when he was little, he's fine now and he believes he can do it because some top boxers who were sick still made it. Dan sits him down, sharing that the mindset is also an important part of boxing. It takes a lot of concentration, and he has to block out every distraction to win the fight. Determined, Matthew asks if he'll agree to train him, and Dan eventually agrees, setting up a schedule. This makes Matthew really excited, and he jumps for joy. After classes the next day, Hector taunts Matthew when he sees him in the hallway, surprised at his change of clothes, but Matthew doesn't pay him any mind. Joining in, Joe shares that Matthew is now training with Dan, making Hector mock him. Well, if only he knew. Later, Ruby and Matthew take a walk, and he shares that he's now training with a personal trainer. Their little chat diverts into talking about her art skills, and she shows him her drawings. Matthew is blown away by how good they are, but is even more amazed when she shows him a drawing of himself. His training fully begins, and Dan admits that he's really good for a new boxer. Matthew offers to lend a helping hand with Dan's work in order to pay him back, but Dan refuses. He reveals that he'll call his friend who owns a gym so they can get him real sparring time, making Matthew super excited. He asks to take the gloves home and Dan agrees, but reminds him to keep the training between them. The next day, Hector meets Matthew in the hallway, telling him that he told the coach to give him another chance since his hit is strong. Matthew doesn't believe this, but Hector seriously tells him that Harward is giving him and some other guys one more shot for a special trial, so he needs to be at the gym after class. Matthew finally believes and agrees to be there. This definitely sounds all shades wrong. Later, Matthew arrives for the trial and Hector leads him into the ring. Turns out Harward isn't present after all, and it was just a lie. Hector begins going hard at Matthew. He throws vicious and hateful punches, sending Matthew to the floor. Luckily, Dan arrives just then and puts an end to this. However, Hector mocks and taunts him for being a janitor, insisting he can't do anything. Dan quietly gets in the ring and Hector tries throwing a punch, but gets headlocked before he can even blink. Dan pushes him away and Harward arrives just then. He takes Hector with him, while Dan helps Matthew stand. Upon arriving home, Matthew speeds past Christine, covering his face, but she follows him into his room. When she sees the big bruise on his eye, she gets angry and stands to call the school. Matthew stops her, insisting it would only make things worse and he would handle it himself. Though she doesn't agree at first, Jacob also insists, saying that Matthew is no longer a little boy, and she finally gives in. The next day, Harward meets up with Dan at his work shed and shares that he's spoken to Hector, who would apologize and stay away from Matthew. Dan isn't satisfied with this, but Harward reminds him that Hector is the best fighter the town has ever had, and he's going places. He knows what Dan is doing, trying to push the kids because he sees himself in them, but Harward feels Matthew just doesn't have what it takes, so it's best he stops. Dan corrects him, sharing that Matthew has heart, which only makes Harward laugh, because who needs heart in boxing, right? He turns to leave, but Dan proposes a deal. Harward lets Matthew fight Hector in the box-off with a ref, or he talks to the principal about the fight. Harward doesn't believe this, thinking Matthew has no style and would get hurt, but Dan believes in him. He finally agrees, under the condition that Matthew's parents sign the consent before leaving. Later, Dan meets up with Matthew at the library since he doesn't show up for practice, but Matthew isn't up for it that day. Though it's okay to feel down, Dan feels that what matters is getting back up, but Matthew is no longer sure of himself. Dan tells him a story about a hero and a coward, urging him to determine who he is.
But the only person who can stop you from doing something is you.
He tells him that he has a fight coming up, and Harward agreed to let him in on the box-off, making Matthew surprised. Scared, Matthew feels Hector would finish him, but Dan tells him he's on the team if he wins, and if he loses, he did his best. With no room for slacking, he instructs him to pick up his books and follow him for training. After practice, Dan hands him a release form, sharing that his buddy Avery has agreed to let him use his gym for sparring sessions. However, Matthew's parents need to sign the form before anything happens. Now, that's definitely going to be the real challenge. However, later that night, Matthew fakes the signatures and signs the form himself. Well, the poor boy can't be blamed for that. The following day, the sparring sessions begin, and Dan coaches him all the way while he spares with another young opponent. Little by little, he begins making great progress, following the routine Dan set up over the following days. After a day of training, Dan shows Matthew a picture of him and Harward when they were younger, on the day they fought at the Golden Gloves. Though Harward is the one with the trophy, everyone felt like it was Dan who won. Sometimes, the judges see in a different light, and Matthew remembers a story on a similar fight which happened before he was born. Well, that's why the important thing is to love the sport and not the glory. Later, Jacob and Christine drive Matthew over for a hangout at Ruby's house. Just like every mother behaves, Christine tries coming down to talk to Ruby, but Matthew stops her, quickly leaving with Ruby before she embarrasses him. They spend the time watching a movie together, and before you know it, their feelings take over and they share a kiss. Matthew is elated by this, and he wraps her in his arms, giving her another kiss. Teenage love is definitely easy. The next day in school, Hector begins taunting Matthew and Ruby in the hallway, but Matthew gets angry. He tries to throw a punch, but Hector is faster and lands a strong one on his abdomen. Thankfully, it doesn't escalate more than this, and they all go on their way. Later, Nick meets up with Matthew, and Matthew excitedly tells him about the kiss he shared with Ruby. She appears just then, and a loudmouthed Nick blurts this out, making her storm off angrily. Matthew tries pursuing her, but Nick stops him, insisting Ruby is a bit dangerous since she's most likely having premenstrual symptoms. In class, Matthew doesn't concentrate. Instead, he scribbles Ruby's name on his book. Afterward, Doyle admonishes him for skipping his assignments, which are half of his grades. He hasn't turned in a total of 3, and the limit Doyle set is 2 before the parents are called. Matthew apologizes and suggests he take the assignment right there. Doyle doesn't see how he can do all 3, but gives him the paper anyway. To his surprise, Matthew begins doing them accurately. Ruby still doesn't talk to Matthew the next day, making him sad. During his time for training, he doesn't see Dan at the shed, but practices anyway. Unfortunately, trouble awaits Matthew when he gets home. Turns out Lee came to talk to Jacob and Christine and has told them about Dan training Matthew. Dan has been fired, and they've learned the truth about the fake signature. Matthew tries speaking for Dan, insisting he didn't know and was just helping, but this doesn't do any good. In a fit of anger, he begins yelling, telling them that he's quitting without Dan, since Dan was the only person who believed in him. Though Jacob shares that he and Christine have thought about it and agreed to let him do the box off, Matthew isn't interested, as he storms out. Later, he pays a visit to Dan, who's tending to his boat, and apologizes for lying, which cost him his job. Well, Dan wasn't planning on being a janitor all his life, but doesn't like the fact that Matthew lied. Matthew begins crying, but Dan consoles him in his own way.
Relax, kid. If anybody should be crying, it ought to be me. I'm the one that got fired, not you.
He asks what Matthew would do next, since he has a fight coming up, but Matthew has given up because he can't do it without him. He feels Dan wouldn't even be there, but Dan reminds him he's on his own regardless. He won't be in the ring with him, and he's just at the corner to guide him along. The real deal is between Matthew and his opponent, and every 3 minutes he's given in the ring is when he gets to show the world what he's made of. Matthew admits he's scared, but Dan tells him that he wants him to feel scared. What matters is that he gets up and gets in the ring, doing his best, no matter the result. The next morning, Matthew gets up early and Christine gives him his breakfast, feeling nervous about the fight. He assures her he'll be fine, giving her a kiss before going for a few laps. In school, Nick and Ruby meet up with Matthew in the hallway, and Nick makes a joke.
It's a big day. Should we, reserve a hospital bed for you?
Ruby shuts this down, confident in Matthew's abilities. After Nick leaves, she admits she's missed Matthew, and he apologizes for blabbing. She shows him a drawing she's done, one of him winning the box off, making Matthew smile. She thinks about adding Hector on the ground, defeated, but Matthew wants all her attention. Before she leaves for class, she wishes him luck in the ring and leans in for a kiss, blowing Matthew's mind away. At the locker room, Hector is surprised to see Matthew and goes to taunt him with Joe. However, they are at a loss for words when Matthew puts them in their place, and they both leave, with threats of finishing him in the ring. Dan comes in just then, and Matthew is excited to see him. He admits he's nervous, but Dan tells him to stick by what he's learned and block out everything else. He reminds him that Hector is as nervous as he is, and wishes him luck. The box-off officially begins, and the champions and contenders are led inside to the cheers of the audience. Christine and Jacob are present, and Dan also sits among the crowd. Harward gives the opening speech and rules before kickstarting the competition. Charlie, Christine's dad, also arrives, and she's surprised to see him, learning that Jacob called him to watch Matthew. The first round finishes, and Joe is brought up with another contender. However, in a twist of fate, the contender wins the round, making Matthew surprised. He recalls something Dan told him.
Everybody's afraid, Matthew. But how you react to that fear is what makes you the hero or the coward.
He's up next, and his friends and family cheer for him as he climbs into the ring. Matthew freezes inside, but manages to snap out of it. Harward gives them instructions, and the fight begins. The only thing playing in Matthew's mind are Dan's words as he starts, but Hector manages to get him with some punches. At her seat, Christine already feels like throwing up, seeing her baby get punched. However, Matthew also lands his first strong punch, surprising Hector. Just as the bell dings for the first time out, Hector throws an angry punch, which is against the rules. However, this is overlooked. Seeing no one in his corner, Charlie decides to go encourage Matthew. Meanwhile, Harward scolds Hector, instructing him to start playing by the rules. Matthew is surprised to see Charlie, and Charlie gives him words of motivation and some helpful instructions, making him take water. The next round begins, but Hector wins, throwing hard punches this time around. During the break, Dan is allowed access to Matthew's corner, and he goes to talk to Matthew, boosting his confidence with words of encouragement. The third round starts off really bad for Matthew as Hector begins punching him, but blocking everything out and focusing on just Dan's voice in his head. Matthew successfully lands a hard punch, taking Hector down. Hector recovers before the countdown is over, and they begin fighting again. However, Hector gains the upper hand, and just when it seems like all hope is lost, Matthew begins striking with all he's got, grounded by Dan's advice. In a final move, he punches Hector, the force taking out his mouth guard, landing him down. Matthew is automatically declared winner as the bell dings, making everyone cheer in excitement. Dan climbs in, carrying Matthew, smiling and excited about the win. Accepting defeat, Harwood tells Hector to go and do the right thing, and Hector acknowledges Matthew, admitting it was a good match. The judges pass their scores, and Harwood announces Hector as champion, having won 2 rounds out of 3. Matthew's mood instantly sours while Hector gives a small talk. However, Harwood surprises everyone by revealing Matthew as the alternate in the middleweight division. Since Hector graduates this year, the school would need someone to win the championships. Matthew is beyond excited, and he says a few words of thanks to his family, friends, and finally Coach Dan. They hug warmly, and Dan tells him he'll be leaving to get some things done. Matthew tries to return the gloves, but Dan urges him to keep them before parting ways. The family gather for picture time, with Ruby joining in, as Nick captures the moment that seals Matthew's victory. If you've made it to the end, hit the like button, comment, and share. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next recap.